We'll do a review in Lakuta Sichas in Chelek Chav Beis. This is the second Sicha for the Parsha Behar. This is a Rashi Sicha in which the Rebbe compares a Rashi in the Parshas of Behar with regards to when the Ebed, when he goes free during the Shnas HaYovel, how it relates also to his children, as the pasuk over here in Behar talks about. And then we have the parsha in Parshas Mishpatim, when the slave goes out, as it relates basically to the wife, Yotza Ishta Imei. And the Rebbe is going to ask some powerful questions in the Rashi here, Rashi there, and the differences. And the Rebbe is going to, in the end, explain that because in our parsha we're talking about a person who sells himself. I'm sold by Bezdin. Sorry, but in Parshas Bahar, it's selling himself. In Parshas Mishpatim, we're talking about being sold as a slave by Bezdin. And the Rebbe is also mechadesh that in Pshuta Shel Mikra, it's different than the halacha that a father can sell also a son, with a whole lot of lumdish and tremendous insight in which all of the very powerful questions and seemingly differences in Rashi, which why Rashi changes, everything will be smoothed out. But let's go step by step. Aleph. In Heintiker Sedre Zog the Torah. In this Sedre, in portion of Behar, the Torah says, as a Eid was hat sich verkauft als Evet zu a Zweitnin, that when a Yid sold himself as a slave to another Yid, is when es kommt Shnas HaYovel, so when the Yovel year comes, the Pasuk says, V'yotzo me'imach hu uvanov imay. So the Yovel year, he gets to leave him, the slave himself, who he, uvanov imay, and also his sons can leave as well. Stellt sich Rashi auf hu uvanov imay. So Rashi places himself on the words he and his sons with him, uniz mefarish, and he explains. He brings down from the Gemara. He says that Omar Rabbi Shimon, says Rabbi Shimon, im hu nimkar bonov mi machrob. If the Eved, he was sold, but who sold his sons? Why are they going out? One of Imai, they weren't sold. So why would they go out? Who sold them? Elomikan, but from here we learn Sharabai Chayev B'Mzoynes Bonov, meaning that it doesn't really talk literally that they were sold and they work for the master, but all what it means is that the rabbi is obligated to feed his sons, the sons of the Eved. They leave when it comes Yovel, when the slave leaves, so the obligation to the sons goes away as well. That means his son go out from him, from his obligation to feed them. They were never sold to him. Mimachrav, who sold them. And therefore, the sons go out means only that he no longer has to feed. Darf man verstehen. So, first of all, we need to understand why the introduction, the Rebbe asks, if he sold himself, who sold his son? Just say, who sold his sons? The Shaila in Pasuk is doch blois Banav Mimachram. The only question we have in the pasuk is who sold his sons. It says they leave him, but they weren't sold. So why does Rashi say also the introduction? If he was sold, who sold? Why do we have to talk about him? It's not the issue. He is not the issue. The issue is the children. Who sold the children? Why are they going out? And that should be the answer. Why does Rashi bring down also the question, Imhu Mochar, Imhu nimkar, if he was sold. Why is that negate? The Rebbe gives the regular rule that Rashi does not just bring down the quotes as is in the Gemara or where he quotes it from. So even though this is a lashon that is appears in the Gemara, but Rashi doesn't have to quote that if it's not negated to the pshat. Afal pi ados is the lashon fun Rabbi Shimon, even though this is the language that Rabbi Shimon used that's brought in the Gemara. Is aber wie gerät kam upon him, but as we have spoken many times, nit in Yone von Rashi bepirusha. It's not Rashi's idea when he writes his commentary al HaTorah to meitig sein droshis Razal b'Lashonom to quote the expounding teachings of our teachers of blessed memory using their language. That does not Rashi doesn't do that. Underfar, and therefore, because Rashi does not just quote whole pieces from where he brings it from, so that's why is that oftmal. Therefore, many times Rashi changes, Mishane, he changes, Upshita, and for sure Mashmitu Mekatzer, he leaves out and he shortens from Loshen Razal, from the language of our sages of blessed memory. Behesem to Pirush HaKosav al Pipshute Shel Mikra, so that it fits the interpretation of the pasuk according to the pshat of the pasuk. So what's the Rashi important to quote this from the Gemara? Imhu nimkar, if he was sold. Then, when we take a look and we compare this, a very similar Rashi in Parshas Mishpatim. Over there we talk about when the Eved goes out by Shemitah. Here we talk about by Yovel, but over there it talks when he goes out by Shemitah. So over there, if you look over there and you try to compare, and you see that Rashi does not write this lengthy language over there in Parshas Mishpatim. The Tmiya in them is noch starker. The surprise here is even greater. In the Parsha von Eved Ivri in Parshas Mishpatim, in the portion of the Hebrew slave, Jewish slave, in the portion of Mishpatim state, over there it says, Im Bal Ishahu, talks about when it comes the Shemitah, the 7th year, he goes free, not Shemitah, it comes 7th year. So it says, Im Bal Ishahu, V'yotza Ishtoi Imei. If he has a wife, if he's a husband of a wife, this Eved, then his wife goes out with him. So we have the similar question, but she wasn't part of the slavery. Why does she have to go out with her husband? Und Rashi is mefarish, the Yotza Ishtoi Imoi, his wife goes out with him, and he doesn't say anything about the slave, he just talks about the wife. V'chi mi hichniso, says Rashi, who brought her in that she's going out? She takes it that she goes out now. Elomagid hakosu, but the verse is telling you sha'akoina chulu, that the one who purchases a slave chayiv b'mezoynes chulu is obligated to feed the wife. And Rashi says the children. The Rebbe will talk in a minute about the children, but he is obligated to feed. He's obligated in the mezoynes, etc. So we see over here in the question, Rashi doesn't say, oh, Mela, he sold himself, but who sold his wife? So over there, same question. We're just asking about the wife. Why does she go out? Whoever sold her? And the answer is, she's not sold, but he's obligated to feed her. So why does Rashi over here have to say, if he sold himself, this introduction? Zet Mendort. We see over there, as Rashi zok takeni de hagdom. Rashi doesn't say the introduction. Imhu nimkar, nor gleich if ishta. He just asks on the wife that the pasuk says that she goes out. Who brought her in that she goes out? So the question is, hein farvos do. So how come here in unser sedra, in our sedra, is that magdim? Why does he introduce imhu nimkar, the words? If he was sold, who sold his sons? And the Rebbe says that Pella is noch aggressive. The surprise is even greater. In the Gemara, where Rashi quotes from the Parshas Behar, in our Parsha Behar, over there is both drushes as it pertains to the Parshas Behar with Yovel and Bonov, and also the Parshas Mishpatim as it pertains to Shemitah and Ishtoi. And the Gemara brings the exact same drush over there, but Rashi by us brings from the Gemara as quoted. But in Mishpatim, Rashi doesn't quote from the Gemara. Rashi quotes from the Mechilta. The Pelle is not aggressive. The Moker from Maimer Rab Shimon, was Rashi bring Biparsha Seinu, the source of this saying of Rab Shimon that Rashi brings down in our Parsha is in Gemara, is in the Gemara. Und dort bringt sich, and over there it's brought down, as Rab Shimon hat euch gedarschen dem Posik from Mishpatim. He also expounded the verse of Mishpatim. Over there it says, V'yotz o ishtoi imoi. His wife will go out with him, that we say in the portion of Mishpatim by the Eved Ivri. In themselves signet. And over there in the Gemara, it's in the same style. Omar Rabbi Shimon, this is on the Parshas Mishpatim. Imhu nimkar, if he was sold, ishtoi min nimkara, was his wife sold then? Who sold? Mikan Rabbi Chaim. But this teaches us from here that the master is obligated to feed her, and that's why she leaves, meaning he leaves the obligation, doesn't have to feed her anymore. Von deswegen, and yet, is dort Rashi nicht matig dem Loschen von Maimer Reb Shimon. Rashi does not quote the same piece that he's quoting here. There, he doesn't quote the language of the saying of Reb Shimon, Imhu nimkar chulu. Nor bringt from Mechilta. Over there, with some changes, the Rebbe talks in the Hara later on. But he brings it not from the Gemara, brings it from Mechilta. Directly, who had brought her in so that she goes out now. But in our case, in the portion of Behar, bringt them Loshon from the Reb Shimon. He brings the language of Rabbi Shimon. Why? Nochmal. Furthermore, we don't even need to ask a question, who sold them? Rashi usually doesn't ask a question, but he gives the answer. Rashi should have said basically that Mekan, the Rabbi Chaim b'Mezonos, without saying who sold them. This whole question and answer is not Rashi's style. Nochmer. Euch was Rashi bringt the Werte. In addition, besides Rashi bringing the whole introduction, he sold himself. But even when Rashi brings the words "bon of mimochram," is nicht verstandig. It's also not understood. In Teures Kohanim do bringt sich lechatchila der limud from Posuk. In the Teures Kohanim over here, in the Parshas Behar, he brings to begin with the lesson, what we learn out from this Posuk. It says Rabbi Chaim b'Mezonos bonov. The master is obligated in the feeding and the food of the sons. Under Hagdomas Hashayla, without the introduction of the question, Bonov Mimachrav, who sold the sons? Rashi could have quoted from the Teres Kohanim, not the Gemara. Hodach Rashi was darke b'pirusha. So Rashi, whose usual way in his commentaries needs to magdim zayin the Shayla, is not to introduce the question in Posuk. Oder noch geben them tiritz and then to give the answer, not to sagen lachatchila, but he says to begin with, blois them pirush impossible. He just says the interpretation of the verse. So, if the Teres Kohanim does it, so Rashi, who normally only gives the answer without making the introduction, Rashi for sure should have begun with the commentary. That from here we know that the master is obligated the feeding of the son without saying who sold them. Nitzu magdim zayin the shaila, and not without introducing the question, Bonav mimachram, who sold their sons. Um, the Rebbe tries in his base to say perhaps if we pay attention over here by Yovel in Behar, it says who ubonov. So we talk about who also. But in the Pasuk in Mishpatim, it says v'yotzo ishtoi. Imai, there's no who. So maybe because there is the word who in our Pasuk, that's why the introduction. And the Rebbe will explain. Based. L'cheire wollt man gekent masbir sein dem Shinui zwischen the zwei Pirush Rashi. It would seem that perhaps we would be able to explain the differences between these two commentaries of Rashi. Ados is totally in them Shinui Haloshin in the zwei Psukim that this hinges on the change of language in these two verses. In unser Pasuk state, in our Pasuk, it's stated in the Parshas of Behar, who ubon of Imai. So it says, it goes out he and his sons. The Ribe ret euch Rashi wegen them. That's what Rashi also discusses, because in the Pasuk talks about who. Im hu nimkar bon of Imachra. Mele he was sold, but who sold his sons? Because the Pasuk is also talking about who, that he goes out. Mashenkin in Parshas Mishpatim, as opposed to the person of the person Mishpatim, steht bloß wie Yotze Ishte immer. It just says his wife goes out. It doesn't say who the Ishte. On the word who, sagt Rashi bloß v'chimi ichnisse who brought her in. So this would answer the first question, why in Behar we're talking also about him, and in the Parshas Mishpatim we're just talking about the wife. Would answer because over there the pasuk doesn't say who. We're not talking about him, but over here, since it says who, we're also talking about him. But that hezber is clowned. Must be that explanation isn't sufficient at all. Because Rashi wrote his commentary on the Torah in total, specific, and brief, short. He doesn't just use a beautiful language or the Loshen Nofel Loshen, or one language that goes on the other Loshen. Because the Pasuk says who, so Rashi starts off with the who, that's not Rashi style. On the bald im hu nimkar is nit kein Pirusha from word who, since if he was sold is not really explaining the word who. But steht im Pasuk. The Pasuk says, "Nor bloiza hagdomo zu bonav mi machram." But this is just an introduction. He sold himself. Who sold his son? But we don't need is mamonashach. So, if the shaila bonav mi machram, if we're going to say that in order to understand the question that who sold them, we need to introduce saying the father was sold. Father ahagdoma im hu nimkar. If he was sold, who sold his sons? But we need that introduction before we can ask who sold the son. But Rashi gedarf zogen die hagdoma. Ich bepirush parshas mishpatim. Rashi should say this introduction also in the portion of mishpatim to start off. If he got sold, who sold them? Because that would be important to understand the second part of the question: who sold the wife? Who sold the kids? Und ob die Shaila fordert nicht die Hakdama, but if the question who sold the wife does not require, as Rashi Mishpatim says, it doesn't ask, it just says who sold the wife. Was the far bringt es nicht Rashi be Parshas Mishpatim? That's what Rashi doesn't bring it down. In Parshas Mishpatim, oh, he sold himself, but who sold his wife? Rashi doesn't start with him. Pavos bringt es Pavos bringt es be Parshas. So how come that he bring this in our Parsha? Can't say just because it says who and who, that doesn't make a difference. It has to do with the contents of the question. Do we need that introduction or don't need that introduction? So why over there in Mishpat there's no introduction, and here in Behar we have the introduction? If he sold himself, Muzman zol. So therefore we have to say, Asidoa shinui in toichon tzvishin the tzoi psukim, that there is a difference in the content. There's a content different between the psukim, not who, a word, something different content. Was there far But euch recht werden was that because there's something more in the psukim and there's a different content. That's why it'll also become uh, answered, and it'll be okay. That first of all, that Aleph in Parshat Mishpatim bringt Rashi nit Maimer Rabbi Shimon nor from Mechilta. That in Parshat Mishpatim Rashi does not bring the statement of Rabbi Shimon from the Gemara, but he brings it from the Mechilta in the name of Rabbi Yitzchok. Be Parsha Seinu is Masim Davker Maimer Rabbi Shimon, but in our Parsha it's Davker Rabbi Shimon. Rashi doesn't bring the name from the Mechilta either. I'm just said that the Mechilta is as the Rebbe will say. But over here, it's important in Behar to bring the statement of Rabbi Shimon because of the content of the Parshas Behar. And in the Parshas Mishpatim, Rashi has no reason to bring that. As the Rebbe will explain why, but the Rebbe is just saying that's what we have to say. Beis, the Parsha saying is Rashi might them Shem Bal Hamaimer. In our Parsha, Rashi also quotes the name of the author of the statement, Rabbi Shimon. Mashenkin in Parshas Mishpatim, as opposed to the portion Mishpatim, bring nit Rashi them Shem Bal Hamaimer da Mechilti doesn't bring the name of the author, the name of Rabbi Yitzchak. Okay. Then the Rebbe starts with another question that which is on the Parshas Mishpatim. Mentioned earlier that over there, the Rashi asks, Mikan Ishte Mimochra. So Rashi says over there, Parshas Mishpatim, Mikan Sharabi Chayiv Bimzeinis and also Bimzeinis Ishte Ubonov. What does the pasuk talk there about Bonov? How do we know pasuk is Bonov? So let it be that in our pasuk it says Bonov, but why would Rashi bring it over there? It's totally not understood. Nochat Mia Gimel in the Tzvei Pirush Rashi, in the two Rashis. In Parshas Mishpatim, it's also in our parsha because in our parsha it doesn't say Ishtay. Over there, when it says Ishtay, Rashi brings down Bonov. But by us, where it talks about Bonov, Rashi doesn't say Ishtay. In Parshas Mishpatim, Zokt Rashi, Magi, that Kosim, this passage tells you, Chayiv b'mzoynus Ishtay uBonov. Also the sons. Chotshim Pasuk werden Bonov Niedermont. In the Pasuk, no mention of sons over there. So what do we know that the sons? Zogum Mefarshim, so Mefarshim explain that those was Rashi is Moisiv Bonov, that Rashi has Bonov, maintain nitzu Zogum, Rashi does not mean to say, as we learned this up from the Pasuk Yotze Ishte Imay, we learned it from the verse, Yotze Ishte Imay. There's no hint for Bonov over there. That's not what Rashi means to say. Because as we said before, the Pasuk read nor wegen Ishtay. The Pasuk in Mishpatim is just talking about his wife. Kemen von dem nit wissen, kemen nit wissen din Mezoinus Bonov. We cannot know about the law of his sons. Wie steht in Gemara, and as it says in the Gemara, is noch mehr al pisvore yesh loimar. That we don't know about the sons over there. Is Nochmer Apisvara Yesh Leimar. Logical, one can say that you don't have to actually feed their sons. As Davke Ishtoi, but maybe just the wife. She cannot go around begging around the doors to beg for food. It's not respectful for a woman to walk around the doors and asking for charity, asking for food. Is Rabbi Chaim Wolosow? So that's why the master has to provide to feed the wife of the slave. So not his son. So we don't know from the son. So how does the Rashi say that the master is chayiv for his sons, feeding his sons as well? Rashi Mishpatim. Bald sagt dem din vom Söhnes Ishtoi, but since he's already saying you the law about feeding the wife, bringt schön derech agav. So by the way, he brings down euch dem din vom Söhnes Bonov, also the law of the feeding of the sons. Verlosen dich sich auf dem Posuk in unser Seder. Rashi relies on the verse of our Seder. Und wie steht da in Mechilta? As it says in the Mechilta, the source of Rashi's quote in Parshas Mishpatim, Chayiv b'mezonos seho u'b'mezonos bono. And over here it says the Mechilta Shenemar, he brings the Pasuk of Behar, v'yotze me'imach hu bonav imoy, that the sons go out. So that's the source for Rashi in Parshas Mishpatim. But the Rebbe doesn't buy that. Because this is aber that Pirush is tzarich in God. This is something that needs to greatly be understood because it doesn't really fit. Vile. If we're talking already about mentioning things, by the way, why not mention in our parsha when we talk about Bonav also Ishtay, by the way? Besides the fact, this is an additional question. In this logic, Rashi should have, in our parsha, to mention, by the way, Ishte also his wife, in Teres Kahanim. And in Teres Kahanim it says, Ma Rabbi Chaim b'mezoin noisov, Av Rabbi Chaim b'mezoinis Ishte ubanov. So there is in the Teres Kahanim written that also mezoinis Ishte ubanov. Why would Rashi not mention it over here, only over there? But besides that, is Ma doch as the Mechilta. How would Rashi rely on the pasuk from later on? The source of Rashi, the Mechilta. The Mechilta uses the pasuk in Behar as evidence in Parshas Mishpatim that you have to feed the Banov. And Rashi just says Banov without bringing the source. Ma'atoch has the Mechilta. Since we see that even the Mechilta daf of Taichem Befedish needs to translate explicitly. As Mizoines born of lernt men up von an ander posik that the feeding of the sons the food we learn from another verse. But Rashi, so then Rashi was his mefaresh pshute shel mikra. Rashi explains the simple meaning of the verse and also for a 5-year-old. Why would he just say should have done like that? Say where we know ubonov instead of saying just bonov. Muzman zogel. So therefore, we have to say no. It's not based upon the pasuk in Parshas Behar. Rashi would have said it if that's what was Rashi's basis. So we have to say as loit Rashi limud al derech hapshat. According to Rashi, learning it according to the simple meaning. We could learn the feeding of the sons from the fact that he has to feed his wife. Is nicht verstandig. And that's why Rashi says both. Was darf man haben noch a limud from the possible Parsha Seinu? Why do we need a special limud that you have to feed the children? As Rabbi is that the master is obligated to feed the sons. If in Parshas Mishpatim we see the fact that he has to feed the wife, he has to feed the sons too. Why do we need the pasuk in Behar to tell you that you have to feed the sons? What does the pasuk tell us? We know Bonav already from the Parshas Mishpat. The Tmi is noch größer. The surprise is even greater. Not only does Rashi in our Rashi not explain why we need this pasuk, but Rashi seems to say that it's only from our pasuk that we know the sons. Rashi be parsha seinu is medayik b'lashoinei. Rashi in our parsha is very specific in his language. Elo mikan sherabi Chaim b'mezenes bonov. From here, we know that the master is obligated in the food of his sons. Nit vi in parshas mishpotim vu zogdam loshem magid akos. The pasuk tells you. But here it says, from here we know, which means Rashi is madgish. Rashi emphasized the limud is mekandafke that we can only learn it from here, or not from another earth, and not from a different place. And by us in Parshas Mishpatim, Rashi says it from the Ishtay. We know Bonav also because, as we said before, we're not relying on this pasuk in Behar. Kommt uns as the zwei Pirusha Rashi seine Mistira Zelazet. These two Rashi's interpretation contradict one of other. In Parshas Behar, Rashi says we know it only from here, Mikan. In Parshas Mishpatim, Rashi says Ishtay Ubonov, that is the sons as well. The Rebbe's key answer is that Rashi's problem is the word who. Why does the pasuk have to tell us who? V'yotzo with his sons without saying who Ubonov. Dalet, wird man das verstehen, behagdim noch diuk in Loshen Rashi b'Pirshusein. Another diuk. So first the Rebbe begins with the Loshen, and the Rebbe is machadish, a tremendous chidush over here, that according to Pshat, a father can sell a son also, not only a daughter. And that explains the language that Rashi uses over here, that he changes from the Lashon of the Gemara in here in the Parsha Behar. So the Anochadik in Lashon Rashi Parsha say Rashi hyped on. Rashi begins Im hu nimkar, if he was sold, the Lashon nifal. It happened that he was sold, not active selling. If he sold, was sold. But then Rashi says, who sold, not how were they sold, but who sold them in their act. Acted the act of selling. It would seem, but Rashi gedaf nutzen them Zavaloshen by Beten. Rashi should have used the same language by both. Oder, either he should have said imhu nimkar, if he was sold, one of minimkar, were his sons then sold? Or imhu nimkar, one of minimkarim, are they sold? Oder, or he should say imhu mochar atzmoi, if he sold himself, one of mimochar, who sold his son? The act of the son. That Pele in them is not gresed. The surprise is even greater if the language in the Gemara is taka so. In Gemara is taka the Loshen, imhu nimkar, if he is sold, one of minimkarim, can his son then be sold? So it says both in Loshen nifal. Rashi is mishane from the Loshen and zog one of mimochram. And Rashi changes from the language and he says, who sold his son in the act of Loshen Paya? Der Biur Bazeh. So the Rebbe explains this. Aderech ha'alocha ken nit an av verkaufen b'noi hakot nalsa eved. A father cannot sell his son, young son, as a slave. If you learn up from posik, the chiyimko ishas pitoy. It says a man can sell his daughter. He can sell his daughter, but not his son. Und der Vater nutzt die Gemara dem Loschen, Bonov minim korim, can sons be sold, not who sold them. See, them there is no possibility of sons being sold. Al derech hapshat omer, but in the style of pshat, can man from posig v'chiyim kirishas bita lomo, that from the posig that a man sends his daughter lomo nit medaik zayin bitoy nit benoy. You cannot derive and say only a daughter, not a son. Weil the parsha ret lechatchila wegen dinim v'yuchodim von an omo ivri. It talks about the specific laws as it pertains to a maid servant, a Jewish woman servant. Und der Far steht bitoy, says daughter, because of those special halachas amavriya. But also his son, he's able to sell. Balsis Nitokin Tama, then Chapshat. There is no reason, according to the style of Pshat, there's really no reason to Mechalik Zayin to make a difference between a son and a daughter. As bidei kener farkeifun unid benoy, and not his son. Doesn't high time is Rashi Mishana for Loshon Hashas Unzog. That's where Rashi changes it. Nit minim korim, not can they be sold, which means that they can never be sold, nor mi mochrom. But who sold them? But Adera Chapshat can then farkeifun bonov. You could sell, but the shail is not mi mochrom. They weren't sold, but not that they cannot be sold. And the Rebbe will later on also explain why by the father we say also the Lashon Nimkar and not Mochar, as we'll see later on. I say, Al Pizeh wird euch sein verstandig der Arichus Lashon Rashi. Based on this, we just explained that the sons could possibly be sold. So now we can understand Rashi's long language, Imhu Nimkar. The Rebbe is going to explain that Rashi is bothered why the pasuk has to repeat again who. And therefore, one would think that maybe it's talking about two types of sale. The one sale of just who, and another sale of Banov. And the pasuk is telling you that they go out. That's why it says who, and then it says Banov. So, but we're saying no, they weren't sold. Because we don't find in the pasuk, mi makram, who, if he was sold, whoever sold his sons, because we're trying to show from the who. Let's look inside. Rashi is eine Schwernit, nor the Wörter Uvon of Imoi, not just the words Uvon of Imoi, which means how did they get sold? What does it mean that he goes out, his sons with him? Nor euch der Wort who, was der Fall is matik euch dem, Rashi is bothered by the word who. That's why he quotes euch dem Wort in the Dibra Maskel, also the word who in the opening statement. The Lechere is der Wort who in Posuk Ibri. It would seem that the word who in the verse is extra. It says that he can go out of you. He'll go out from you together with his sons. You can't learn it, so therefore, what would we have learned? We would have been able to learn. Since in our parsha we're dealing with in a case where your brother has become destitute, he's become desperate, and he sells himself. Main the Torah midu one of imoy. So when the Torah means he and his sons with him, to midamezayin tzvei mitzias, to hint to two scenarios, two cases, two mitzias. V'yotzo imoch, saying go out from you, ret in fall. Wenn hot verkauft, blois sich allein als Eved. If he only sold himself as an Eved. And then the pasuk says, "Hu ubon of imoy." Red wegen afal. That's talking in a case when the yomuch hachichi is a pasevai is so poor. Your brother is so yomuch. Bizer hat zusammen mit sich together with himself verkauft euch seine Kinder. He also sold his children. Bonov ubnoisov, sons and daughters. Even though it says bonov, in the bonov ubnoisov, everybody. Unav dem, sagt heute, as wenn es kommt Shnas Hayovel, when the Jubilee year comes, v'yotze me'imach, either he will go by himself, if he is the case where he sells himself, or Hu born of Imar, here and his son with him. But Rashi says no. Un Adam Pirish is Rashi Shalom Mitzanarichus Aloshin, and this is Rashi rejecting and showing that this is not by talking the long language, saying Im Hu Nimkar, if he was sold, Bi Shloimo Hu, we can understand him state in Im Befedish, because about him it says clearly V'Nimkar L'cho, he'll be sold to you. Aber Bonov Mimochro, wo steht in Posik? Where does it say in the Posik as er hat sie verkauft? As the Posik is all the Nog der Zählen wegen Zeri Yitzil Lechere, so that the Posik is telling us about going free. It doesn't say that they were sold. But the whole thing is because it says who Ubonavim. That's why we would think that you go out free because of the sale. But since it doesn't say anywhere that he sold them, so we're saying no. But otherwise, maybe this is the pshat in the pasuk. Rashi has to negate that. In Parshas Mishpatim, wo steht v'yotza ishta ima. Over there, it just says his wife goes out with him. On the word who without who hot nit Rashi was to bringen dem Loshon for Rab Shimon imhu nimkar. Doesn't Rashi has no purpose in bringing from Rab Shimon if he was sold. Only over here because the who can be misinterpreted. Of them entvet Rashi. So what does Rashi answer? What is the answer to the question who sold the sons? Elamikan, sons and daughters. Elamikan sharabe chayiv b'mzonis bono. As mit hu ubonov imay, that when it says hu ubonov imay, retni de toide wegen yitzil l'chedus. We're not talking about going out free. Nobody sold them and they're not going out free. That's not what we're talking about. Nor wegen dem din vom zoynes in welchen Rabbi is mechuyim. That this is the halacha that he goes out, that you go out and free, which the Rav, the master, is obligated. Was benegei lazeh, as far as this, the obligation to feed, seinen euch bon of imay b'rishus Rabbi. So also the sons are with the father in the master's domain that he has to feed them. Und wie bald das in dem Chiv Mezoines von unser Posuk is da achidush. And since that there is obligation to feed, is not only that there's an obligation to feed the sons, even with regards to the Eved. Also with regards to the Eved himself. Kidl Kamon Siv Zayin, as the Rebbe will explain in Siv Zayin. Zog der Posik, that's why the Posik says, Nit nor bonov imoi, not only sons with him, dem chiv if mezenes bonov, nor who ubonov imoi, dem chiv if rabbi to speisen dem evet, that he is obligated to support him. So v'yotza, when we say that Rabbi Chaim mezenes bonov, on top of the who ubonov imoi, that he's chayiv also for him, because there is a idea, as the Rebbe will explain, we're talking over here about selling yourself. Why should we say that the rabbi is mechuyev, as the Rebbe will explain? And the Rebbe gives now the general difference between the pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim and in our parsha. The mechiluk von the zwei psukim, the Parsha Seinu Vov, the Mishpatim and the Parsha Seinu. Rashi gesagt in Parshas Mishpatim, Rashi has already said this in the portion of Mishpatim. As the Parsha von Eved Ivri dort, the portion of Eved Ivri in Mishpatim redt wegen an Eved, was machruhu based in Beganevose. They're talking about a slave that Beis Din sold him because of his theft. He didn't have money to pay for something that he stole, so Beis Din sells him. Mash Enkein, as Rashi said there, the Parshas Eved Dividend Unze said it, as opposed to the portion of Eved Dividend in our said the Redwegen Amoicher Atzme Mipnei Dochakoy. We're talking about somebody selling himself because of his difficult situation, his press situation. He doesn't have any money. That your brother will be poor and he will sell himself. He's selling himself. So this, from it comes out a main distinction in the Mgeder Achiv from the Odin, in the definition, the obligation of the master to give mezonis liishta yubono from the mevet, to give the food to the wife and the sons of the evet, depending on how he was sold. If he was sold by Beis Din, then there's an obligation, seemingly, and the wife and the children. And that's why Rashi adds in Mishpatim Abonim. When he sells himself, it seems like there's no obligation at all. Sold yourself, make your own arrangement. When one is sold by Beis Din without his consent, he doesn't want to go become a slave. It makes sense to say, as Beis Din bavoren die Tzrochim for seine Bnei Bayis, that Beis Din takes care of the needs of his family. This haste. That means Ados was Torah is mechayiv them odin b'mzenis ishta is. Why is the Torah obligating the master to feed the wife? Need to leave their toyeles was their odin hot, not because of the benefit of the master that he has. Durch them was ishta shel ha'eved is leben dem eved. That the wife of the Eved is next to, close to her Eved. Uzi is an Ezer Kinegdoi, and she is helping him. Und tut for him alle Malachas, and she does all work for her husband. Shoi Solabailo, woman does for her husband, so then he would be paying her the mezoinas for the benefit that he gets. No, but that's not the case. No, this is a din of Beis Din. It's a law for the Beis Din. Azay muzum bavoren and tzorchei ha'isha. They must take care of the needs of the woman. Was aderech harogil tutes der man. On the usual way, it's done by the husband. Und der Far read up Beis Din milachatchila miten odin. That's why Beis Din, to begin with, agrees with the master as that he has to give the food for his wife, because since he's an Eved now and her needs are usually done by her husband, and if her husband is not available because he's working as an Eved, the husband must take care of her needs. Is moving the pashto. So we also understand, simply speaking, as Ma'adok Beis Din bavonet mezona isha, since Beis Din even takes care of the food of the wife, but she can gain arbeiten bavashpeisen sich. She can go to work and feed herself. Is doch kolske v'kavachomer. So there's a foratory for sure, of course. As Beis Din mus bavonem zenis bonov, the Beis Din must protect and be conscious, make sure that there's food for the sons. Haktanim, no minors, was kennen nicht arbeiten, they can't work. Und der Vater is Rashi Meisiv, Mezonis Ishto Ubono. Rashi adds, in addition to the wife, also the sons. Even though the Pasuk it doesn't say, because it's a foratory, it's a Kavachomer. As opposed to selling himself in our parsha. Was the Mechire is Medas Uberotzen Shneihem. This sale is with the consent, is with the knowledge and the consent of both the seller and the slave. They both agree. Nicht verbunden mit Beis. This isn't tied to Beis. Hot Beis nicht was zu mischen sich. So Beis doesn't get mixed in. Mechayiv sein den Odin zu geben, besonders Ishto Bonov, to give the master the food for his wife and his sons. Und if them Odin is nicht shaykh in Chiyuv, and on this master there's no obligation to mefarne sein, mishpachas or evet, to support the family of the slave. If that wasn't agreed to begin with. So haben doch nicht kein Scheiches zu ihm. The wife and the children have no connection to the master as soll sie mechuyev sein speisen, that he should be obligated to feed them. Votman b'meile gesagt, so therefore we would have said, as by moicher atzmei darf der eved bazorgum b'zeines bonov. So we would say that when you sell yourself, let the slave, the one who sold himself, he has to provide the food for his sons. Maybe they're like all the other poor people in the city who don't have anybody. Of them, so here the Torah, no, the Torah is machadish. From here we learn that the master, there's a new obligation of the master to feed the sons. This is a chidush din b'Torah. This is a novel halacha in Torah. As a filu by moicher atzma, even if he sells himself, is Rabbi Chaim Wolosow, the master is still obligated to feed the sons. Zion. So the midvet, when I verstehen was the posuk is madgish, that's why we'll also understand why the Torah, the verse emphasizes who uban of imay. Also, he goes out, meaning he also loses the food, that he also gets fed. But in the fall von meicher atzme, because in the case that he sells himself, is euch dos was der evet bakumt mezoinus von Rabbi Achidush, because this is also that the fact that the slave is being fed by the master is also Chiddush. Because one would can say, as der Odin is nit mechuyev to give them evet kemizoinus, that the master is not obligated to give this slave any food. Pavozol is I mechuyev to give them evet. Why should he have to give to the slave more than they have agreed upon to begin with? As told him, Farzain Abdus, whatever he pays him for his slavery. Upshita, and even if you're going to say that it must include payment, but he can give him just a minimal amount of food. Upshita, and it's obvious that one can say, as the Odin is Yotze, that the Odin fulfills his obligation, mit geben them ever to give the slave lechem tsar umayim lachatz, just a minimal amount of bread, a little bit of water, as der eved zol haben koyach to arbeit, just so he has the strength to work, aber not more than that. The riber bavoren Torah b'miyuchad, that's why Torah specifically, who uvon as Rabbi Yischai b'mzenoisov, al derech harog, let's give him normal food, not just lechem tsar umayim lachatz, but give him normal food. What about, what's the status of the woman? Can we know from this pasuk? And the answer is we don't know for sure. That's why the pasuk Rashi doesn't mention it over here. Over there, the bonov come together with Ishtar when Beis Din sells them. But over here, that this is a separate obligation, new obligation. The master, maybe the Torah only required to take care of the sons and maybe not of the wife. Ches. Based on the above, it's understood that Rashi in our parsha is not moisif ishtoi. He doesn't add ishta al derech where is meisi bonov in mishpotim, similar to that he adds bonov in the parsha mishpotim. Val pshute shel mikra zeh ret nit, because in this pasuk this doesn't discuss zok nit wegen isha. It doesn't say anything about the wife. Umatzat svara ba'alma, just an idea alone without the pasuk saying. Kemazog become avadim. There's you can say various different ways. It's not clear. You can say that even though the Torah obligated by Beis Din that he has to take care of the feed of the food of his wife, but maybe not by when he sells himself. By Amoicher Atzmai, Ken Men Mikan. So from this case, Fun Mizoinus Bonov, that the Torah obligated you to feed the sons, need uplernen auf Mizoinus Ishta. We can learn for that for the feed of his wife also. We can zogen, because one can say, as those was Rabbi Chaim Bonov, the reason why the master is obligated to feed the son, although on his own he should not have been obligated in this, is norval the Torah hat rachmanas on the kinder. That comes based because the Torah have compassion for the children. But they're not able to protect themselves and provide for themselves. But maybe the wife was and she has the ability to feed herself. Is a rabbi from Amecher Atzmi, so the master of somebody who sells himself, nit chayiv and maybe he's not obligated to feed her. So you can say, we don't know. Gam yesh loymar. But we can also say, on the other hand, as Rashi that even the Rashi, according to Rashi Shita in his commentary in the Torah, Rabbi Chaim is he's talking Chayiv in his wife. I feel by Mecharatzme. Why? Because we balder odin hotate elas from them. Since the master has a benefit from the fact that the wife of the slave is together with the slave, kinal sivov, b'meilis min hastam. Maybe when there's no specific agreement, there others to speisner. That's his obligation to beginning to feed her. Can say that way too. Aber kinal das is nit an inyan was learned up. It's not something which we can learn from Bonov. That because the sons, it's different. Bottom from bnei ha'eved haktanim, because from the young children of the Eved, Hotni that Odin came to Ellis, he doesn't have a benefit. So even if we would say that he has to feed him, but it's not something we can learn from the Bonov, because the Bonov, there's no benefit. So on his own, he would not, he does not obligate himself to feed him. So, but but this is not something which the pasuk, but this is a logical question, because maybe you should split the wife, because since there's a benefit to him, so maybe that's the obligation at the beginning, but not from the pasuk. So Rashi can't learn this. Oder as melerentes of from mecharu bezdin lois them prat. The other end, we can learn, because by Macharu Bezdin, we only learn on the detail. That we don't really care that she can feed herself. Bezdin is machriv the modern zu speisen. So over there, by Bezdin, we see Bezdin forces to feed her. In the case when Macharu Bezdin, as der Odin Muzir get mizoines mitzad der te'elos was hot for it, because there's a benefit. He has to pay for her if he has to feed her. Und kann sich nicht paten mit der Taina, as he soll sich allein speisen. She should feed herself. So you have different ways of saying it. Maybe the Rav is mechuyev, and maybe he's taking potter, but it's not something that we can learn out. Now the Rebbe explains why we bring down over here Rabbi Shimon, because test, because the question really is, at the end of the day, why is the master obligated to feed the sons when he has no benefit from them? Test. And he sold himself. This wasn't part of the agreement. That's a Talmud Memulach. A sharp student can overfragen, can ask, Seif, at the end, Favos is der Odm Chayim Zaynes Banov. Why is the master obligated to feed the sons of the slave? He has no connection with them. He has no benefit from them. Was is schuldig? What's his fault of the master as der Av hat sich verkauft zu ihm, that the father sold himself to him as Eved, he sold himself as a slave, as so Muslim Bazarg, that he has to take care of them. Dinam darf sein wie alle anderen Anim, was in Stadtgenal, they should be treated, the halacha should be like other poor people in the city who don't have anybody to support them, Kinal. Is Rashi merames dem tiritz. So Rashi hints for this answer to bringing them Shem Bal Hamaimer, by bringing the name of the author of the statement, Rabbi Shimon. Was the Shitose is those verstandig. In the view of Rabbi Shimon, in his view, this is understood. Rabbi Shimon ben Yechoy sagt in Masechta Baba Basra. Rabbi Shimon says in Tzak Baba Basra, Kol she'ene maniach ben liyotsha HaKadosh Baruch Hu mole olav evro. Anyone who does not leave behind a son to inherit him, Hashem is full of anger on him. From Lashon Rashbi, from the language of Rav Shimon ben Yechoy, is verstandig, it's understood. As redt nit wegen dem Einish var nit mekayim sein mitzvahs prurevu. He's not talking about the penalty, the punishment, because you didn't fulfill the mitzvah prurevu. You didn't be born fruitful, multiply. You don't have a son, so you hadn't done the mitzvah. Nor redt wegen dem prat. Doesn't say you have children. The yorshay. He wants you to have somebody to inherit. Then a mensch lost iber a ben liyorshay. When a person leaves behind a son to inherit him, is this goyrem heipach for mole evra. This brings about the opposite of anger, full of anger, because there's happiness, there's a simcha, there's joy because he leaves behind a son, which is the opposite if he doesn't leave a son, which is mole evra. Beim Obersten, Obemela, Bert mole evra, ben es felt ben liyoshe. So that's why Hashem is full of anger, is not besimcha when there is lacking a son to inherit. Loit Rab Shimon bar Yochai, according to Rab Shimon bar Yochai, is the hadgoshe in kinder, the emphasis by children, as izol zayin ben liyosh, there should be a son to inherit. Kom tachas oviv, he should get up and be in place of the father. That av ben zayin ein hemshech bis ein mitzias. The father and son are one continuation, and they become one entity. The father and son become one entity, that there is a connection, there is a flow, a continuation. Und das ist der Biur Favos Rabbi Chaim Wolosow. That's also the reason why the master is obligated to feed the son. Das ist mitzad zeir shaychus zum Av. That is because of the connection of the son to their father. Kishem beres mechayim b'mzonos ha'ava eved. Just as he's obligated in the food to feed the slave, the father, azoy is chayiv to speisen dem chelek av. Then he also has to feed the part of the father, but das is bonov. His sons are part of him. That's the hemshach. Also the continuation after the Yotzo who one of Imoy Goimer. So the Pasuk says, Vel achuzas avois of Yoshu, when he goes back to the inheritance of his father. Ubonov seinen benitten ze ein mitzias. In this case, they're one together. Well, derech ze mamish, and similar hu va'avosav. This is the part of his father, the obligation. They're one mitzias. Derech ze mamish hu va'avosav. B'meila yoshuv el achuzos avosav. He goes back to the inheritance of his father because that is that inherent flow of connection between the father and the son. Based on this, it's sweet was Rashi tied Pshute Shal Mikra. Why is Rashi saying in the Pashtim Pshat, Belachuzas Avoisov El Kvoid Avoisov, takes on the honor, whatever the father was respected, the children go to Achuzas, they get back to that honor. Kishem b'metornit abteilundem evet von seine Kinder. Just as we cannot differentiate, separate the slave from his children, who uban of ima, you have to feed them as well. Azoi torment them evet nit abteilung von avoisov. So also, you're not allowed to separate the Eved from his fathers, from his parents. Und der Far, just like the second generation, the Ben, from his father, so the slave is velachuzas avosim. He goes back to the slave, to his fathers. Und der Far velachuz avosim kved avosim yoshuv. He goes back to his father's honor. He goes back to the father of the slave. And that's why Yoshuv velachuz avosim. This all tells us, according to Reb Shimon, in the connection between a father and the son, explains to us why the master has to feed the son as well. And then the pasuk continues, and the slave himself will go back to his parents, to their honor. Yud, from the wonderful ideas that, based on the hint in this Rashi, that Inyan von wem verkauft als Eved, the idea of being sold as a slave is aremes if Inyan Hagolus. That hints to the idea of exile. Zog der Posig, the Posig says, aside thereof and side bonov, it is both the father and the son. Sai kaviyochel avinu shebashamayim. Also, so to speak, our Father in heaven. Unsai, and also in Bazayin Bonim Lamokim, that are sons. Zayin Avek in Golus went away into exile. That's the idea of slavery. K'mayim Reb Shimon bar Yochai, as Reb Shimon bar Yochai says, same Reb Shimon, Chavivim Yisrael Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is the special expression of love, dearness of the Jews, the Yidden, in front of Hashem. Shebechol Mokim Shegolu Shechina Imam. Wherever they are in exile, the Shechina goes with them. Of them, of this, bringt Rashi, Maimer, Rab Shimon, was hat halt noch aggressor on Eiftu. So Rashi brings the saying of Rab Shimon, which tells us even a greater novelty. Nit nor las kol mokim shegolu Yisrael shchina imon. Not just that wherever the Yidden exile to, the divine is with them. Nor adrabe, imhu nimkar, bonav mimochra bitmir. How could, if Hashem puts himself in exile, but how could the Eibishter put, who sells them, bitmir? Bishleima, the Eibishter ken sich kaviyochel verkaufen and goes. The Eibishter Hashem, we understand, he, so to speak, can sell himself into exile. Valeri zakil yochel, he's all able. B'meila ken sich hereinstellen and goes. He is able to put himself into exile. Und zusammen damit nicht stane werden durch Golus, and together while being in Golus, not to be changed through Golus. Aber bonov mimochra. But who sells the sons? Wie kann man verkaufen bonov? How could you sell the sons in Golus? the Yid in Golus. If Golus hot ashlita, if Golus dominates a Yid, so how could you sell him? Kemen doch bei ihm nicht stehen begolui. Ken doch bei ihm nicht stehen begolui, as is ben lakodesh baruch Hu. So you cannot see by him that he's a son to Hashem. Entweder Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, Reb Shimon Yochai answers, as das was Bonam sein in Golus is as men nit wie Zeire und legabe Zeire mezoinus. That they're in Golus, it's only theirs, and as it relates to their feeding the mezoinus, tzorich haguf, the needs of the body. They gain adur durch Golus. They go through the exile. The Msar HaMedina, the officer of the country. Oh, but the soul of a Yid is not verkauft geworden in Golus, chas v'sholem. Has, God forbid, not been sold into exile. Kipiskam hayidua, as the known saying, nor unsere gufim seinen übergegeben in Golus. It's just our bodies that have been given over to exile. Aber unsere neshames, but our souls, hat men in Golus nicht vertrieben. They have not been chased into Golus. Und in Shibut Malchus nicht übergegeben, have not been given over into the slavery of the governments. Those was says is given a churbun, this that there was a destruction is those blois benegeya, that only as it connects, relates that Gashim is from Beis Hamikdash, the physicality of Beis Hamikdash, the eitzim va'avonim, the wood, the stones. Over there, on them the goy has a dominance. But on the true Beis Hamikdash Aruchni, the spiritual Beis Hamikdash, and also similar, on the Beis Hamikdash which we all need to make within ourselves, their Beis Hamikdash was Yisdo Bayeder Eden, the Beis Hamikdash that exists by every Jew. Hot a goy kein shlitanit. A goy has no dominance. In them is Nechayach Kin Churban. Over there, there's no destruction over there. Kemen Meinan. So what you can think? Okay, Yotz is only Legabe Mezoinus. Kemen Meina Beneged Mezoinus Al Kolponim. So you can think, but okay, as it relates to the Mezoinus, Tzorchei Haguf, needs of the body, Golus, yeah, Shlita of Yidden. Golus does dominate, does have a dominance over a Jew. Sufiren sich has visholem ve'as kumt ois by anitin, to conduct himself, God forbid, as it seems by a non-Jew, to dominate the Yid's physical. Zokt Rab Shimon mikan sherabi chayiv b'mzeines bonov. The master is obligated to feed his son. The Eibishter hat nor gewollt. It's just that Hashem wanted, as the mezoines from the Eden bisman hagolus, that the food of the Yidden during the time of exile, so durchgehen dem Sar HaMedina, it should pass through the officer of the country. But the Sar HaMedina hat nit kein shum deya. He has no opinion. He has no say. Says will get me in zayde mezoines or they're need whether to give the Yidden the mezoines. The rabbi is chayiv to give them. That is blois ki garzim biyad hachitzer, but he's merely like a metal in the hand of the one who digs with it. Unochmer. Furthermore, at his mechuyev to bazorgin Eden, he's obligated to provide for Yidden b'chol tzorcheim hagashmim, all their physical needs. Obemele bakumen Yidden, and therefore the Yidden receive oich bisman hagolus, also in the time of exile. Boni chayi umezoyne revicha, son's life, food in a wide way, betoiv anirev anigla, in the visible and revealed good. This is Mesichas Shabbos Parshas Behar B'Chukoisai Tovshin Lamed Aleph and Tovshin Mem.